was very narrowly lost. It was like 333 to 331. But the amazing thing was that the pro-Israel groups had spent millions of dollars trying to defeat this initiative and could only eke out a victory of 2 votes. And I think it will come back in 2014 at the Presbyterian General Assembly, and the battle will be fought all over again. But the point is, it really matters. I mean, when you see that something like that was just 2 votes, it really matters that people get involved wherever they are, whether it's in a union, in a church, in a college. I think those are some really practical and useful ways to get involved.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for a great presentation. I don't know much about the issue, it's really clear. So that's the first thing. Second of all, I just wanted to, when you were talking about putting the balance of power back together, more ethical way than the race to arms, which I think we all agree is not the good solution. I'm Jewish, and I grew up in a Jewish neighborhood in Europe. And we kind of have this very strange relationship with Europe in general, which affects the United States less than the example you took most of the talk, with what happened during the Second World War. And when we talk of a right to the Jewish state, there's always this very awkward background of knowledge of what Europe as a whole has done. I come from France, but France is probably as anti-Semitic, or was as anti-Semitic as Germany during a long period of time. So I was kind of wondering, how would you say somebody in Europe, a regular person, can deal with both the knowledge of what his ancestors have done and what he can do in the future without breaking his own ethic?
Thank you. That's a very powerful question. Well, you touch, or your question draws a lot of historical threads which need to be teased out a little bit. And you didn't say this, but what you said kind of hints at another common argument for supporting Israel as a Jewish state, which is that the Jews suffered tremendously in history. The Holocaust was an enormous catastrophe that was inflicted on Jewish people, and that therefore the suffering of the Jews is exceptional, and therefore Jews should have this exceptional status where they're allowed to discriminate against Palestinians. And that's essentially what it boils down to. Another part of that is that some people say that, well, because of what happened, it could happen again, and therefore Jews should have a safe place to go. Now, there's a couple of problems with that. Number one is that the basic ethics. So one is, or let's say there are 3 things. One is Israel as sort of a moral recompense for Jews. Because Jews suffered, therefore they deserve Israel. The second thing is Israel as a safe haven or a refuge. Now, the first one, the moral recompense, the way I think about that is that the ethics of that are really intolerable, because Palestinians are not the ones who inflicted this catastrophe on Jews. And therefore, if Jews as a collective deserve that moral recompense, why should it be at the price of someone else? And to me, that's intolerable ethically, unless you can accept an ethics in which one group of people, that their rights or their future trumps that of another. And that's not an ethics that I can ever identify with. Now, the idea of Israel as a refuge, I think, is also morally difficult, because it says that, if you're a Jewish person living in the United States, where in 2013 Jews are among the best integrated, successful groups in this country due to the incredible history of immigration and achievement that Jews can look at in this country with a great deal of pride, that you somehow have the right to keep on hand a spare country somewhere else. at a tremendous price to the people who live there is to me morally abominable. That really your effort ought to be to make sure that this country that you live in is one which defends the principles that are going to defend all people, including Jews, from any kind of racism. So it means fighting a fight against anti-Semitism, against xenophobia, against the mass incarceration of African Americans and people of color, against the mass deportations of Latino people. It involves a struggle to make this country one where the largest number of people will stand up for others when they're oppressed because of who they are. That's the investment you should make, not in having a nuclear armed settler colony halfway around the world. And there's been a lot of, thank you, there's been a lot of debate about a recent survey done by the Pew Research Center among American Jews that shows the number of American Jews who feel this strong attachment to Israel is declining. And part of the reason for that, I mean, it's a longer discussion, but the sort of the bullet point is that young American Jews are by and large, I mean, we're generalizing here, but to a great extent, are among the most liberal and progressive and integrated people in this country. So they identify with the ideals of this country, the ideals of the civil rights movement. When they're asked to support Israel, they're asked to put all that aside, and they can't do it. And, so when forced to choose between progressive and universal inclusive values on the one hand and Israel on the other, they increasingly don't pick Israel. So to me, that's the future. Now, this question about anti-Semitism in Europe, it's very contentious. But, the reality is, I mean, yes, there's anti-Semitism. Like there are other kinds of racism. Right now, I would say that the most severe form of racism in Europe is against Muslims, against immigrants, and against Roma, as we've seen from recent news stories, but that's something that's been really pervasive. Jews in France are among the most integrated communities, do very well. That doesn't mean there haven't been racist attacks on Jews, but the notion that Jews are going to leave en masse for Israel, or that they're going to face another catastrophe like the Holocaust, again, to believe that and to say that in order to prevent that, we have to continue to turn away from the actual present atrocities that are being done in the name of a Jewish state is also intolerable. I think, again, you have to fight for the kind of societies that will protect everybody, including Jews, from that kind of persecution. The final irony is that, when Benjamin Netanyahu comes here and says, the world needs a Jewish state, as a Jewish state. I'm not talking about, this is separate from Jew. No, when I say I oppose Israel as a Jewish state, let's be very clear. I don't oppose Jews living in historic Palestine, what is present-day Israel. Not at all. I believe in people living there in a different kind of relationship. But when Netanyahu comes and says the world needs a Jewish state because there could be a second Holocaust, he also comes here and says, Israel is under threat from Iran. In 6 months' time, Iran could have a bomb, and it's under threat from the Palestinians, it's under threat from Hezbollah, and so Israel is simultaneously a refuge, and simultaneously, according to Netanyahu, this absolutely frightening place for Jews to be. And, so where would you rather be Jewish? In Montreal, or in Brooklyn, or in Winnipeg, or in this beleaguered country that is just waiting to be nuked? So there's a lot of cognitive dissonance in these approaches. That's a great question.
Could you repeat the question?
Could I repeat the question? Yes. So I talked about readmitting the Palestinian people, Palestinian refugees returning. And the question is, how could that happen in a way, well, given the fact that there are Israelis living there, how could that happen in a way that it doesn't, let's say, significantly harm the Israelis who are already living there? Is that a fair summary? So this is a very good question, and there are the answer involves questions about the particular facts of Palestine, but it also involves questions of principle. And the questions of principle are universal ones that have been applied in other situations of refugees returning to places that are now occupied by somebody else. So, and that's true in recent history, for example, in Bosnia. Bosnia is a relatively recent war where since that war, since the 1995 peace agreement, more than 500,000 refugees have been returned. It's a small country, 3 million people. So 500,000 is a very significant number, have returned with international support to places that are now inhabited by people from, an enemy group. And so people were ethnically cleansed, others came in and were occupied or settled their homes. So with Bosnia, the principles that were established, which is that you have a primary occupant or a primary rights holder, the person who owned that house and was expelled and became a refugee. You recognize their right. But the person who lives there now, the present occupant, also has rights. They have a right to housing. They don't want to be thrown out into the street. They don't want to be the victim of revenge. And so you recognize that interest, and then you can come up with alternatives for them, whether it's alternative housing, whether they negotiate some agreement with the original owner, and so on. All those principles exist, and they have been established and tried and tested. That's regarding the general principles. And I'm going to offer a suggestion for a resource that can give you more about this afterwards. Now, the particularity of Palestine is that there are many areas, particularly in cities, where the actual homes of Palestinians are now inhabited by Israeli Jews. And that includes my own, my mother's house. My grandfather's house still exists, and there are Jewish families living there. I don't know who they are. I haven't been to the house. But there are many other stories like that. And those would be the most difficult cases where you would have to apply the kinds of principles that I just mentioned and that have been tried in other places. But the fact is that for the vast majority of Palestinians, the places where they came from, the lands on which their villages were built, are empty. They're now, they've had Jewish National Fund forests planted on them, or they're just empty. And so there is, and that's the case for the vast majority of Palestinian refugees and their descendants. So in the vast majority of cases, return is not a practical question. It's a question of Israel refusing on the grounds that the Palestinians are not Jews. It's not a practical question. So the resource I want to mention is, maybe we can pull up. Thank you. I don't know if this is connected to the internet, but all right. Somebody could you? All right, thanks. And make sure that your password is visible to everyone. Okay. While we fix, okay, great, thanks. So I just want to point you, because this is something that I hope you'll look at afterwards to an organization called Badil, which is a Palestinian organization based in Bethlehem. And this might be too small to read, but it's called the Badil Resource Center for Palestinian Residency and Refugee Rights. And they did a project recently, a little 20-minute film. Thank you. I can't, you have to come and either type or hold the microphone. They did a little 20-minute film called Practicalities of Return. And I'll just point you to where you can find that. This is the website I co-edited called Electronic Intifada. And I recently posted the film on the website. Here it is. So I just did a little story on it, but it's so that the video addresses exactly the question you asked. What would return look like? And what I really liked about this video is that you hear voices from also, as well as Palestinian refugees, from an Israeli organization called Zohrat, which I will. Could you come and put Zohrat up for me? Thank you very much. Do you know how to spell Zohrat? ZOCHROT.org. And this is another resource to look at. So Zohrat means remembering in Hebrew, which is very similar to the Arabic word zakirat in Arabic. Zakirat, Zohrat. And Zohrat is an Israeli organization that supports the Palestinian right of return and educates Israelis about the expulsion of the Palestinians. And so Badil and Zohrat have been working together to begin to imagine what return looks like in practice, to answer that question that you've asked. And there are other projects where Palestinian refugees themselves, and this is crucial, because so often refugees are talked about in their absence. They're talked about as a problem, or they're talked about as a final status issue, or they're talked about as people who are invisible to us. So a crucial aspect of this, of answering this question, is that refugees have to be the ones who answer it. So some of the work that Badil has been doing has been working with refugees who are working with architects and urban planners and others to begin to actually imagine what those rebuilt communities look like on that land that is now empty. So the short answer is, I can't tell you what it looks like, but we have to support these kinds of processes that are inclusive, where people are answering this question. And so those resources are ones that I hope you would look at to get a deeper understanding of it. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I have two questions that come from the fact that I created this discussion about this.
Okay.
So they're sort of probing for extra information for the purposes of our discussion. So one is, your family background is from, is from the lands that Israel took over after the 48 war, right?
Yeah.
So it's very clear from your talk that your argument is mostly about principle. But there's also the fact that a lot of Palestinians live in the West Bank. So for them, like a two-state solution is not, still leaves this refugee problem unsolved. And we've been talking about that, and you've said a lot about that. But is this a practical issue in that, a lot of Palestinians would stand, not all, and you still think everything you said stands? I was just curious if you had thoughts about that, was one. And then another thing I was just sort of wondering that might come up is, well, Czechoslovakia fell apart. And, the Czechs and Slovaks, I don't think, hated each other as much as, unfortunately, we have a lot of Palestinians and Israeli Jews do, and it's just describing this. And thus, one might envision that, you go to a one-state solution for all the reasons you said, and then, and this turns into a two-state solution. Now, that is a two-state solution emerging from a different dynamic than the current one, and you've made your view on that clear. But I was just wondering if you had thoughts on that possibility. I mean, you've thought about this more than I have.
Yes. Thank you. Those are very good questions, and I'll try to answer them. They're questions that ought to provoke another 2 lectures. Each one deserves a lecture. So I'm going to try and resist that temptation.